Hello and welcome to Cosmological Arguments. I'm your host, John Bannan. In this video, I'm going to explain the philosophical causality concept called occasionalism. This is a very important philosophical concept of causality. In the words of the most famous occasionalist of the Western philosophical tradition, Nicolas Malebranche, there is only one true cause because there is only one true God. The nature or power of each thing is nothing but the will of God. All natural causes are not true causes, but only occasional causes. Occasionalism is a theory of causation and time. I'm going to contrast this theory of occasionalism with the block universe based on the theory of general and special relativity. I'll show you the difference between the two. So let's take the example of a cue ball striking an 8-ball. One way to look at that is that the cue ball and the 8-ball are both objects with substantive causal powers. That is, the substance of the cue ball strikes the substance of the 8-ball, and it makes it move with its force. However, you can look at this another way. You can take the whole interaction between the cue ball and the 8-ball and slice it into frames of time or frames of space-time and look at each frame. So when you chop it up into frames, all you really need to do is argue the existence of the frames themselves, which perform all the interaction. And the substance of the cue ball and the 8-ball doesn't actually have to be real. Just the frames have to be real. So you can think of reality as simply a series of frames, and time and movement and forces can be understood as changes in these frames. Now, this idea is really the basis of general and special relativity. So there's a lot of physics backing this concept up. In relativity, which is Einstein's theory, his general theory of relativity, his special theory of relativity, it predicts certain extremely counterintuitive relativistic effects in nature. And physicists and scientists have proven that these effects are real, which gives a lot of weight to the idea that Einstein's block universe is in fact reality. Now, the block universe considers that you're spread out in time, something like the way you're spread out in space. Time would be regarded as a dimension of space-time as relativity holds. So it doesn't pass us in some way because space-time doesn't pass us in some way. So time isn't something that passes us. Time is part of space-time. Instead, time is part of the uniform, larger fabric of the universe, not something moving around inside of it. In the block universe, the past, the present, and the future are materially identical, and all are real and exist. However, the only experience you're having are the ones you're having now at the present moment. The experience you had in the past or the future is just as real in the block universe. They're just inaccessible to you because you are in the now portion of the space time. So, there are certain relativistic effects which have been shown to be true. So, under the theory of general and special relativity, when objects move close to the speed of light, time slows down relative to a uh, frame of reference that is at rest, uh, which is called time dilation. So, an object that's moving near the speed of light relative to an object that's at rest will undergo a slowdown in its time compared to that object at rest. This is true. This has been proven through the use of atomic clocks flown in airplanes. You took a stationary atomic clock and another atomic clock, you synchronized them, you took one of the atomic clocks and you flew it in an airplane, you landed, and then you compared the times. And sure enough, the one that was flown was slower. The times were different when you compared them after the flight. So these are real relativistic effects. They're real. Another relativistic effect is that near the speed of light, uh, the length of an object actually contracts in the direction of the motion relative to a frame of reference that is at rest. So an object that's going near the speed of light would appear to a bystander to actually contract in size in the direction in which it's traveling. And that's true too. And it's not that the object is losing atoms or losing part of itself. It's not. It's that the space time is actually contracting uh, relative to the observer at rest, and that's what makes the object appear as if it's smaller or contracting. And the reason space time has to contract is to keep the speed of light at the same value that is invariant, and the laws of physics the same in all inertial frames of reference. So, because the speed of light has to be the same for all observers in all reference frames, one of the mathematical uh, results of that is the contraction of objects near the speed of light, as well as time dilation. And those have been proven to be true. So, uh, it is correct. It's correct. So these relativistic effects that are the result of general and special relativity give the impression that time and space are relative to the observer's frame of reference. The block universe has you spread out in space time like you're spread out in space. So your existence is actually what's called a geodesic in four-dimensional space-time. That is 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. So the block universe is really this four-dimensional block of space-time, and your existence is just basically it's like an object embedded in that space-time. So you can think of it sort of like this. So here we have the Big Bang, and this is the expansion of space over time. The current age of the universe is about 13.8 billion years. So this would be expansion of space over 13.8 billion years. And in that space-time, there are slices of space-time stacked upon one another, which is the expansion of the universe. And your existence is a geodesic on this sort of graph. Let's say you were born here and died there. That would be your existence in the block universe. That's what you are. So it's important to understand that in the block universe, time is considered an illusion. So change and motion and time are illusions. They're tricks of the brain. And what you really have is just these slices of space time that are slightly different from one another. And you have something called the arrow of time, which only goes in one direction. And that's what gives us the experience of going forward in time instead of moving backward in time. Uh, the arrow of time, there's various rationales for why it would even exist. No one knows for sure, but I think entropy plays a role in why things go this way and not backwards. But the key to pull away from this is there's these frames of space time. So each moment of space time is a frame. And when you stack all those frames together, you get you. You're just basically a stack of frames where your existence begins and ends. And those that object which is you changes through the frames, and that's the experience of time. And that's you. You can't see the past or the future you, but under the block universe, it's just as real as the present moment. The block universe does not explain the existence of the present moment. It doesn't consider the present moment a special frame of reference or a special entity in and of itself. Um, it's no different than the past or the future in the block universe. It just so happens that the now you experience just happens to be a particular frame of the block universe that you happen to be experiencing at your particular time. Therefore, you feel that this is the now for you. But your past you or your future you would have the same feeling. It's just that they're located in a different area of space time. So they have their own now, essentially. Okay. So the black universe and these relativistic effects um, give the impression that we are in this block object in space-time, as opposed to a thing in 3D Cartesian space with time moving past us. That's the old Newtonian physics view of reality, 3D space and time passes. Einstein changed all that, created the block universe, and now we think of reality as space time instead of this Cartesian view of coordinates in space and in which we move through, or time moves in it. Okay, so the block universe is a difficult concept to comprehend, but it's the generally accepted view of physicists as to what reality is. It's this block universe. However, uh, there is an issue with the block universe. Now, these relativistic effects, They give the impression that a block universe is the case, but they don't prove the block universe is the case. In order to prove the block universe would be the case, you would have to travel in time. You would have to travel backward in time or forward into the future and get something, some sort of information, and bring it back to where you were. That's the only way you could prove that these past and future frames are real. Uh, and it would violate uh, paradoxical rules, which is you can't go back, you can't create a time machine. Time travel is, it should be impossible, at least in terms of bringing information to the past or bringing information to the future, or conversely, taking information from the past or from the future and bringing it back to your present moment, because that creates paradoxes. If you could time travel, you could go back in time, shoot your parents before they conceived you, and you're looking over their dead cold bodies, but you've erased your causal history, your future causal history. So where did you come from? You shouldn't exist, and yet there you are, what, looking over your parents' dead bodies. So where'd you come from? Well, the answer would be you came from nothing, which is an impossibility. You can't come from nothing. Um, Nothing comes from nothing. So it's paradoxical. Time travel is highly paradoxical, and for that reason, it's impossible. So you can't actually prove that these frames of space time are real. They're unverifiable. There's no place you could travel outside the block universe in order to see these frames. You can't verify it. You can't leave the universe because of the principle of conservation of energy and mass. Uh, if you were actually to leave the universe, your mass and energy would leave the universe, and that would mean mass and energy disappeared from the universe. It effectively was destroyed, which is a violation of the laws of physics. You can't destroy mass and energy. Uh, so this is unverifiable, but it's the common belief among physicists and many, many people that this is in fact the case, that it's true. So, is it true? Well, uh, not exactly. And I'll tell you why. Einstein's theories of general and special relativity use something called tensor calculus to express spacetime. Calculus is the mathematical study of change. It's mathematics. So the equations that are used in relativity are based on calculus and based on mathematics. And mathematics itself has a certain aspect to it which does not exist in physical reality. And that's the uh, aspect of infinities. So if you take a mathematical concept like a number line, on a number line from 0 to 1, mathematically speaking, there is an infinite number of points between 0 and 1. We call these in mathematics infinitesimals. So you can divide between 0 and 1 an infinite number of times in mathematics. The question is space time infinitely divisible, just like mathematics? And the answer is no. Relativity is based on mathematics. It assumes supports infinite divisibility of space-time because it's based on mathematics. But is that true? Does physical reality actually have an infinite number of frames of space-time, creating this block universe? And the answer is no, it can't. It's impossible that would be the case. So there's a problem between the theory of relativity, which is based on mathematics and infinities, and physical reality, whether infinities are real. There has never been any scientific proof that anything in physical reality has the quality or characteristic of being infinite. So, why is this? Why can't you divide space time into an infinite number of stacks? This is called the continuous view of space time. So, this number line is continuous. It doesn't have a finite number in it, a finite indivisible unit of numbers. It's continuous, it's infinite in that sense. So many people assume, based on the mathematics of relativity, that the block universe is likewise continuous and contains these infinite frames. Well, that's wrong, and I'll tell you why. Uh, so you can think of, well, you know what, let me erase the board. So let's take a close up of some area of space time from let's say, point A to point B in time and space. So you're moving from time A to time B in space time, and you can think of it as a bunch of changing frames. And because um, because frame two is slightly different than frame one, it can be considered the next frame. And frame three is slightly different than frame two, and frame four is slightly different than frame three. And it's this progression of these slight changes in the frame that creates our experience of time and change and motion. A good analogy would be a movie film. So a movie film has a discrete number of frames in it, and as each frame goes by, the projector puts that image on the screen, and as those frames go by, we get the experience of live action, that there are no frames, that there's something going on here, that there's real people on the screen and they're doing things. So this is a good analogy. It's not perfect, but it's a good analogy to what I'm talking about. So there has to be differences in which each of these frames show in order for there to be a change or even the illusion of time or motion or change. However, under the calculus of general relativity and special relativity, these frames are infinitely divisible. So you can pick any one of these frames and essentially blow it up. Let's take frame 4. And under calculus, this should also be divisible, infinitely divisible. And again, each of these subdivided frames must also be slightly different than their adjoining neighbor in order to give the illusion of time or change or motion. But because of the calculus and the infinities inherent in the number line and in mathematics, these subframes can also be divided. And those divided subframes can also be divided into subframes. And you can keep doing this forever, continuously dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing forever, for infinity, according to the theory of general relativity and special relativity. And each of those frames, those adjoining frames, have to be slightly different in order for movement, time, and change to exist. So this presents a problem for this block universe continuous idea of space-time. The problem is that you can't continuously divide frames to infinity, because you can't create adjoining frames that have differences between them when you reach a small enough scale in detail that it goes beneath the Planck scale or the Planck length. So as you keep subdividing these smaller divided frames, the changes between each frames occur on the smallest of details, not the larger details. Those are unchanging. It's the smallest details that have to change. And the question is, can you continue to do that forever? Now, mathematically, you could do that. You could make representations of change mathematically forever. You could say there's an infinitesimal frame. That's true mathematically. But can you do that in physical reality? And in physical reality, you can't. And the reason is the Planck unit. So there comes a point where things in physical reality can't get any smaller and yet be considered measurable, or that you can do science on them. And this is the Planck scale. The Planck length, for instance, is 1.6 times 10 to the negative 35 meters. Now that is really small. That is smaller than an atom, smaller than a subatomic particle, smaller than a photon, smaller than a quark. That is as small as you can get and still have some meaning in physics. No one's ever observed anything that is this small. But there is this Planck scale, which is a limit. So nothing smaller than the Planck scale is measurable or probable by science. However, if you have this infinite subdivision idea of math, you will eventually reach a Planck scale difference between adjoining frames. And you can't get frames smaller and still maintain a difference between frames. So what you would eventually end up with is two frames whose difference between them is differences in detail at the Planck scale, and there's no further change in detail that you could physically make between those two frames. So you'd have these two frames, both at the Planck scale in detail, and in between those frames, mathematically, there would still be more frames under general relativity, but there's no difference in those frames. So there would be no movement between an infinite number of frames that don't change in appearance at all, which makes this idea of time as an illusion under general and special relativity false, because you'd reach a point where movement would not be possible from this frame to the next frame, because the infinity of frames, if even if they did exist, would all be the same or would have no change between these two Planck scale frames. So there couldn't be this illusion of change or motion between those frames. So it couldn't be continuous. So because of the Planck scale, ultimately general relativity has to have a finite number of frames or subdivisions or sections of space-time in order to create an illusion of movement. And because it's finite, then uh, then the whole idea of the block universe, at least in terms of infinite subdivisions of space-time, is false. It can't work um, because of this. And another point is that the laws of physics themselves break down at the Planck scale. So this idea of going further, dividing even further below the detail of the Planck scale, um, the theory of general and special relativity cannot support that notion because the laws of physics break down. So it's disproven that that could happen, that it could be these infinite number of slices of space-time. Laws of physics break down at that point, can't be general and special relativity anymore. Who knows what happens between those two Planck scale frames? No one knows. No one has a theory of physics to explain it, but it's beyond general and special relativity. This means that the theory of general and special relativity no longer holds true between these two Planck scale frames. And there is no reason to believe that the calculus uh, that these frames can be divided even further at this point is true. Because if special and general relativity breaks down, well, why would you believe that the calculus would have to be true? Because the calculus is just mathematics. It's not a physics theory. This means that relativity does not prove an infinite subdivision of frames of space-time. It proves that time cannot be an illusion of this infinite division of space-time. So there has to be a smallest detailed frame followed by another detailed frame that is slightly different. Uh, that means there has to be ultimately a finite number of frames or a finite number of divisions of space-time. All right, so you may wonder, why is this important? All right, well, so you have to have a finite number of frames of space-time. Um, who knows exactly what the detail between each frame would be, but each frame has to be slightly different in some detail. Otherwise, you wouldn't have motion or change or time for that matter. So you have these two frames. You can look at it this way. This is just for demonstration purposes. This isn't what it would actually look like because you couldn't leave the universe to actually see this. This is unverifiable. But it has to be the case. So you go from this frame to that frame to that frame. There's slight differences between each frame. Whether it's a Planck scale difference or not, who knows? Maybe it is. Um, but what you have here is you've got changing frames. But how does this frame know what this frame is like, such that it could be slightly different? How does it know? The problem is there's nothing in between these frames. There's nothing and there's no time between these frames. So you can't get something from nothing. That's the old philosophical truth, ex nihilo nihil fit. So as you progress to each of these frames, how does this frame know what's on this frame in order to be almost identical to it but slightly different? It doesn't have a memory. How does it know? What causes this frame to be slightly different than this frame when there's nothing in between the frames to cause that change? So the answer is God, obviously. You need an outside creator who knows what this frame was, remembers it, and then creates the next frame slightly different than this frame. So this sort of creation of frames requires a creator, and that creator is God. So this is the idea of occasionalism. The idea of occasionalism is you have these finite frames of space-time or reality, physical reality, and God creates this frame, destroys it, creates this frame, destroys it, creates this frame, destroys it. And that is what we experience as time and change and motion and movement. Uh, it's God's act of continual creation or conservation of reality by creating, destroying, and then and occasionally creating the next frame. This is occasionalism. This is the idea of occasionalism, and it requires a God to be able to create the next frame because it requires a creator and something with a memory that remembers what this previous frame was in order to create the next frame. Uh, this argument can also be turned into a proof of God, which is one of the cosmological arguments, the argument from time. So under the block universe, relativity can't show that space-time is infinitely divisible or is infinitely continuous. And that's because of the Planck scale. Um, see, the way to get around this requirement is to say there is no space essentially between these two frames. It's just a continuity, a continuous number of frames. That's the whole idea of the block universe. But it requires an infinite number of frames in order to do that. But it can't have an infinite number of slightly different frames due to the Planck scale. So relativity is stuck with this idea. Relativity does not accept this idea, but their explanation using calculus is impossible. So it has to be this. Therefore, general and special relativity does not prove that time is an illusion. Occasionalism would say that the frames are finite. There's a finite number of them, but that God creates each frame, destroys it, and creates the next frame and destroys it. Moreover, this idea of occasionalism explains the present moment, the experience we have as the present moment, as this timeless act of creation of a frame. So God creates this frame. That creation is the present moment. It's what we experience as the present moment. Occasionalism doesn't say that the past frames and the future frames are real or that they exist. They don't. They're not real until God creates them. So only the present is real. So under occasionalism is a philosophical form of presentism. Whereas general relativity, the block universe, is a form of eternalism. And eternalism is this idea that the past, present, and future all exist. They're all equally real. So, under either occasionalism or the block universe, finite frames are necessary. As I explained to you, because of the Planck scale, even under the block universe, you still have to have finite frames. So, because of that, it means you need a creator, a God, uh, who's necessary in order to create these frames. Because even if it was a form of eternalism, if you have finite frames, you still have nothing in between frames and no time, which means you still have to have something that remembers what this is in order to create this, because this cannot come from nothing. So you need a God to be able to create this, because this frame has no causal power to create this frame. There's nothing in between them. There's no way it can cause this. So under occasionalism, God creates each frame as a timeless act. So it's not as if this frame is experiencing time or it lasts for a certain duration of time. It's not the case at all. It's timeless. Its creation and destruction is instantaneous. It's timeless. It exists, and then it doesn't exist under occasionalism. It's not something that's done in time or in a greater realm of reality with its own time or God time or space time. It's not like that at all. You can't observe this happening. There is no place for you to go in order to see this occur, because this is the creation of place itself. This is the creation of space time and the universe. There is nowhere to go to see this. And these are discrete, timeless acts. Um, so the frame itself does not exist for a set time, because the frame is a timeless entity. And as an analogy, the photon, for instance, a particle of light, is also a timeless entity under general relativity. In fact, the Large Hadron Collider has shown that you could take two photons and collide them and create mass particles with mass from that collision. So, timeless particles like photons are capable of atemporal or non-temporal causation, creating even new particles. So this idea of a timeless thing like this frame, as an example, the photon would be a timeless thing. So there's reason to believe that this is real, that this is true. So it's the similarity in the minute details between these frames that connects the frames and creates what we experience as time, motion, um, change, like a movie film. Um, but this does not subject God to time because these are timeless acts. There is no way that you can sequence these as a sequence of discrete creations in time because they're not created in a place with time. They're creations, yes, but they're not sequential. The connection between them is the minute differences in the things that are on each frame. That's the connection. Just like a movie film, in a way, that each frame is slightly different than the next. However, under occasionalism, the present is a special. Um, it's special, and we experience it because this is the presently created frame. So, because each frame creation is a timeless act by God, and because there is no time between the frames, even though the frames are not continuous, then God does not subject himself to time by creating each frame. That uh, would only be true if there was a greater reality of time and place in which the frames are created. But there isn't. There isn't. This is the creation of time, space time itself. There is no greater realm in which it's created. So God would only subject himself to time if the creation of frames were done in sequence. That is, there was a place in which the frames were created in which one could observe and order such sequence. However, the frames are timeless acts with no duration or experience in time. And that's because it's the creation of time. That which creates time cannot be subject to time. So these frames are the creation of time. They can't be subject to time. They're not. They don't have a time themselves, a duration of their time. Um, and so without time, there is no order or sequence of this creation. So the frames are ordered based on their similarity to one another, but but the present frame is the only one created in a timeless, placeless fashion. The present moment is this frame, which is a timeless act, and it's not done in a place. It is place and time. So God creates space, time, and universe using occasionalism. This idea of separate frames is necessary to the idea of creation, even under general relativity and special relativity, because of the Planck scale. And also because creation does not occur in time or place, in a greater time or place, then God can create other realities or universes as well. They don't interfere with each other because they're not in any place where they're being created. Um, so, although relativistic effects are suggestive of a block universe, occasionalism can mimic these relativistic effects. So, because the block universe, the present and the past, hasn't ever been proven to be real, because you'd have to time travel in order to do that, and you can't time travel. Occasionalism can mimic relativistic effects, meaning occasionalism is completely compatible with relativistic effects like length, contraction, and time dilation. Um, because God has control over the creation of each frame in occasionalism, God can make it appear any way he wants, including giving an impression of a block universe through relativistic effects. So, because God has control over everything that exists at the present moment, he can certainly arrange it to appear as if there's a block universe and the future and the past are real. But that, in and of itself, uh, is just occasionalism mimicking that sort of block universe idea, which God can do clearly because he has control over every moment of time and space. And that can give the impression of a hidden reality which actually isn't real at all. But he has control to be able to do that. So the reality is we can only examine each frame in the now. We can't go to other frames. It's not that's impossible. So the reality is we only see in the now, and scientific experiments only see in the now. So if you have control over the now, you can make and you're God, you can make it look any way you want, even to give an impression of a past or a future that actually exists, even though it doesn't. Um, so there is no way to look at multiple frames because we can't leave the now. Therefore, the now can give the impression of a block universe without the past and present being equally real, or the past, present, and future being equally real. So, occasionalism is totally compatible with general and special relativity. And occasionalism and this idea of the block universe, the past and the present being real, it's unverifiable because you can't leave the universe, you can't leave the now in order to prove these things are real. Um, but they must be the case because I explained that to you. How you have to have different frames and a finite number of them in order to have this movement um, or change. So, uh, because of that, occasionalism is a great theory. It's a wonderful theory. It can't be disproven. Because it's unverifiable, but it's understandably unverifiable because you could only verify it by going someplace to see these frames, which does not exist because these are the creation of place and time. So there is nowhere to go to be able to see this. The only person who knows for a fact that it is real is God, the person who creates it. So the question is, does the block universe get rid of the need for God? And the answer is no, because even the block universe can only have a finite number of slices of space-time due to the Planck scale. And that means you need a creator in order to create each frame. You need a creator in order to remember what one frame was in order to make the next one slightly different. God is the creator. So because creation is still necessary, even in the block universe, then you still have to have a God, even under general and special relativity. So occasionalism is a very important idea, theist idea, and it also explains why the block universe does not prove God doesn't exist. In fact, you have to have a God as a creator of these frames, even in general and special relativity. Now, Malebranche argued that experience seems to tell us that one body acts upon another. But all that we know is that the movement of one body follows upon that of another. We have no experience of one body causing the movement of another. Therefore, one body cannot act upon another. That's his proof as to why occasionalism must be real. Uh, we have the situation with the cue ball hitting the 8 ball. We have no experience of actual causation between those things. It looks that way, but we have no experience of that. All we know is that uh, one body acts upon another, but all that we know is that there's a movement of one body falling upon that of another. We have no experience of the actual causation. It's just the movement that we experience. And that's what occasionalism is. It's this movement between frames. It's not an actual substance. It's just changes in the frames of time and space. Now, someone might argue that material objects have substance and are real. And they might say that for a material object to be real, it must have causal powers. Now, that seems to make sense, but it's not the whole story. Uh, because every material object is also a caused object. So one could just as easily argue that for a material object to be real, it must have been caused. So instead of this, instead of defining real as having causal power, so for material objects, you could define the real as having causal power. But for an object to have causal power, it would have to have substance. Whereas in occasionalism is claiming material objects don't have substance. They're just frames, which exhibit this change, which we experience as motion and time, as well as the present creation, which is presentism. So occasionalism is essentially saying, no, that's not the right definition of real for material objects. The proper definition would be real equals its cause. It's a caused object. So because the frame in occasionalism is a caused object, it's caused, like a photon is a caused object, a timeless object. The frames are caused objects. They're caused by God, but they're caused objects. And that's enough of a definition for real to claim that these are real. These frames are real things. And all material objects are also caused. So this is a perfectly good definition of real, being caused for material objects. All material objects are caused things. They're caused. So you don't need this definition. This definition works just as well, if not better, for material objects. So these frames being caused are real. So that's some dispute about what it means to be real or not. I would say that if an object is caused, then it's real. And you can't point to any material object that's real and is not itself caused. So I'm right about that. So a critic of occasionalism might claim that because God causes each frame and the frames themselves have no causal power, and thus the frames aren't real under this definition, then occasionalism is only the world essentially dissolving into God, leaving a kind of pantheism. So if you take this definition of real, meaning having causal powers, then the frames in occasionalism, they don't have causal powers. God creates them, destroys them, creates the next frame, destroys it. So the frame itself doesn't have any causal powers. The frame is not causing the next frame. God is causing the frames. So under this definition of reality, reality meaning having causal powers, these frames would not be considered real because they don't have causal powers. But I don't like this definition, and this definition works better because all material objects are caused. So you can say, well, because the frame is caused, God causes the frame is caused, it's a real object. Therefore, you can't make the charge that each frame is not real for some reason. And therefore, it's really just God doing it all. And there's nothing, these frames aren't real, so it's just God. So because it's just God, you're really claiming some form of pantheism. It's God as these frames. That's not true. That's an unfair, incorrect charge, an argument. And it's based on this faulty definition of real when you have a much better definition. And it doesn't even really make sense. If you're creating a frame, God is creating a timeless act, a frame, just like a photon, timeless photon. To claim that that's not real is absurd. It's obviously real, and it's got to be real. Otherwise, space-time wouldn't exist. So this whole charge, this criticism of occasionalism as being some sort of form of pantheism is nonsense and illogical and irrational and wrong. So God creates real frames, which creates the universe. And that's a clear separation between God and the universe, meaning God is not the universe under occasionalism. So there can't be pantheism. Can't be. Because pantheism is the idea that God is the universe. But occasionalism is talking about the creation of the universe, albeit using timeless frames, but nonetheless, the creation of something that is caused, that is real. But that is not God. It is something God creates, these frames. And those frames are our experience of time, motion, reality, space-time, and the universe. So there's this clear separation between God and the creation of these frames. Therefore, God cannot be the frames. God cannot be the universe. Occasionalism cannot be pantheistic. Okay, so I hope you were fascinated by this theory of occasionalism. I consider it absolutely critical to the cosmological arguments and understanding why a God must be real and exists. And it's a great way to attack this the atheistic ideas of the block universe, which is so prevalent because obviously the block universe is far better known than occasionalism because the block universe is based on relativity and Einstein. But from what I explained to you, occasionalism is completely compatible with the block universe, and it also shows how even the block universe requires a God. So any way you cut it, you need a God. All right, take care.